Some people don't flinch when others cry. They don't feel guilt, sadness, or even discomfort when someone is in pain. While most humans instinctively feel empathy, a disturbing minority feels nothing. This isn't fiction. It's a real psychological pattern, and once you understand it, you'll never look at human behavior the same way again. When a person is repeatedly exposed to emotional neglect, abuse, or unpredictable environments, the brain does not remain neutral, it adapts. Psychological research shows that the human nervous system prioritizes survival over emotional richness. In early life especially, when a child learns that expressing feelings leads to punishment, rejection, or more pain, the brain begins to associate emotion with danger. To protect itself, it reduces emotional responsiveness. This is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic neurological adjustment designed to keep the individual functioning in a hostile environment. Over time, this adaptation becomes a stable pattern. The brain strengthens neural pathways related to emotional suppression, while weakening those connected to empathy and emotional attunement. Studies in trauma psychology demonstrate that chronic stress elevates cortisol levels, which directly impact areas of the brain responsible for emotional processing, such as the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. As a result, emotional reactions become blunted. The person is not choosing to feel less. Their brain has learned that feeling less reduces psychological risk. This emotional shutdown often continues long after the original threat is gone. What began as a temporary survival response becomes a permanent emotional style. In adulthood, these individuals may appear calm during moments of crisis, unmoved by suffering, or unaffected by others' pain. From the outside, this can look like coldness or cruelty. Psychologically, however, it is better understood as emotional armor that was never meant to be removed. The mind keeps using the same defense because it once worked. Another important factor is dissociation. Trauma research shows that when emotional pain becomes overwhelming, the brain may disconnect awareness from feeling. This creates a sense of numbness, distance, or emotional emptiness. Empathy requires emotional presence, and dissociation reduces that presence. When someone else suffers, the individual may intellectually recognize the pain but feel no internal response. Their system is trained to stay detached because emotional engagement once felt unsafe. In reality, emotional numbness is not strength, and it is not a lack of humanity. It is evidence of a nervous system shaped by prolonged psychological pressure. These individuals did not lose empathy overnight. It slowly faded as a protective measure, reinforced by experience and biology. Understanding this does not excuse harmful behavior, but it explains a difficult truth. Sometimes the absence of feeling is not a choice, but the cost of surviving something that required the mind to shut down just to endure. When the human brain is exposed to suffering again and again, it does not respond the same way forever. Neuroscience shows that emotional responses weaken with repetition, especially when the stimulus is intense. The first time someone witnesses pain, the brain reacts strongly, activating empathy-related regions and stress responses. But with repeated exposure, whether through real-life trauma, constant stress, or frequent exposure to violent imagery, the brain begins to adapt. This adaptation is not emotional failure, it is neurological self-protection. Psychological studies on desensitization explain that the nervous system has limited capacity for emotional arousal. When that capacity is exceeded repeatedly, the brain lowers its sensitivity to prevent exhaustion. Stress hormones that once spiked begin to level off. Emotional signals that once felt overwhelming start to feel distant. Over time, suffering no longer triggers the same internal reaction. The brain essentially learns that reacting strongly every time is unsustainable, so it reacts less. This process is especially visible in people who live or work around constant distress. Emergency responders, medical staff, individuals in violent environments, or people under chronic pressure often experience emotional dulling. Research calls this compassion fatigue or emotional burnout. It is not that these individuals stop understanding pain, it is that their emotional system becomes overloaded and reduces output. Feeling less becomes the only way to keep functioning. Modern life intensifies this effect. Continuous exposure to disturbing news, graphic media, and online content floods the brain with more suffering than it evolved to process. The mind cannot distinguish between real and mediated pain at a neurological level. As a result, repeated exposure trains the brain to treat suffering as normal rather than alarming. Pain becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces emotional urgency. Eventually, this desensitization reshapes how people respond to others. When someone else suffers, the emotional alarm no longer activates. There may be awareness without feeling, recognition without compassion. This is not because the person is heartless, but because their emotional system has been trained to conserve energy. In psychological reality, emotional numbness is often not a sign of lack of humanity, but of a mind that has been exposed to too much for too long, and learned to survive by feeling less. When a person gains power, status, or a sense of superiority, the brain subtly rewires how it perceives others. Psychological research consistently shows that power increases psychological distance. When someone feels above others socially, financially, or intellectually, their brain categorizes people into groups of importance. Those seen as lower status are processed less as individuals and more as abstractions. This shift reduces emotional resonance, making it harder to emotionally register another person's suffering. Neuroscience studies reveal that power can dampen activity in brain regions associated with empathy, particularly areas involved in emotional mirroring. Empathy requires the ability to mentally place oneself in another person's position. Power disrupts this process by reinforcing self-focus. The more control someone feels they have, the less their brain automatically scans the emotional states of others. Attention turns inward, toward goals, authority, and self-preservation, rather than shared emotional experience. Social psychology also explains that power creates a sense of separateness. When people believe their life circumstances are earned through superiority, effort, or intelligence, they may unconsciously blame others for their suffering. This belief system reduces compassion because pain is reinterpreted as a consequence rather than a shared human vulnerability. Suffering stops being tragic and starts feeling deserved or irrelevant, which numbs emotional response. Over time, repeated reinforcement of status strengthens this emotional detachment. The brain learns that responding emotionally is unnecessary because consequences rarely affect the person in power. If someone's decisions do not personally cost them, empathy weakens through lack of use. Psychological distance grows, and with it, emotional indifference. This is why individuals in high control positions often appear calm during crises that emotionally overwhelm others. In real life, this does not always look like cruelty or intentional harm. More often, it appears as indifference, rationalization, or emotional silence. The person may intellectually understand suffering while feeling no emotional urgency to respond. This is one of the darkest psychological realities of power. Not that it always corrupts behavior, but that it quietly erodes empathy. When emotional connection fades, suffering becomes easier to ignore, and the absence of feeling feels normal to the one who holds control. Some individuals show low emotional empathy not because they were damaged by trauma, but because of stable personality structures shaped by biology and early development. Psychology distinguishes between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy allows a person to recognize and understand what someone else is feeling, while emotional empathy involves actually sharing that feeling internally. Research shows that certain personality profiles develop strong cognitive empathy, but weak emotional resonance. These individuals can accurately read pain, distress, or fear, yet remain emotionally untouched by it. This pattern is linked to differences in emotional processing within the brain. Neuropsychological studies suggest that reduced emotional empathy is associated with lower reactivity in areas responsible for emotional arousal, such as parts of the limbic system. The brain registers information about suffering, but it does not trigger the same emotional response most people feel. As a result, suffering is processed as data rather than as an emotional experience. The person knows something is wrong but does not feel compelled by emotion to respond. Importantly, this does not automatically make someone violent or malicious. Many people with low emotional empathy function normally in society, follow rules, and avoid harming others. However, their relationships often feel emotionally distant. In moments where compassion is expected, grief, vulnerability, or pain, they may appear detached, calm, or indifferent. Reactions are logical rather than emotional, which can be deeply unsettling to others who expect shared feeling. Psychological research also shows that these traits are relatively stable over time. Unlike trauma-based emotional numbness, which can sometimes soften with safety and healing, personality-based empathy differences tend to persist. These individuals are not suppressing emotion, they simply do not experience emotional resonance at the same intensity. Telling them to care more is ineffective because the emotional mechanism itself is less responsive. In real life, this creates a quiet but powerful form of emotional absence. These individuals may intellectually acknowledge suffering, offer practical solutions, or remain composed while others break down. The danger is not always in what they do, but in what they fail to feel. When emotional empathy is weak, human pain can become easy to ignore. This psychological reality reminds us that empathy is not uniform across humanity. It varies, and in some people, it exists more as understanding than as feeling. When a person becomes intensely focused on their own survival, goals, or internal struggles, the brain naturally reallocates attention inward. Psychology shows that attention is a limited resource. When most of it is consumed by personal stress, fear, ambition, or insecurity, there is little left to process the emotional states of others. The mind prioritizes what feels immediately relevant, and anything outside that internal bubble begins to fade into the background, including other people's suffering. Chronic self-focus is often driven by stress. Research in cognitive psychology demonstrates that prolonged stress activates survival-oriented thinking, narrowing perception, and reducing emotional bandwidth. In this state, the brain is less capable of perspective-taking, which is a core component of empathy. When someone is constantly worried about money, status, safety, or personal success, the nervous system stays in a defensive mode. Empathy, which requires openness and emotional availability, becomes neurologically less accessible. Over time, this pattern becomes reinforced. Each moment the brain ignores external pain to deal with internal pressure, it strengthens the habit of emotional self-prioritization. Social pain no longer registers as urgent because it does not directly threaten the individual's perceived stability. Psychological studies show that repeated self-referential thinking increases emotional detachment, making other people's problems feel distant, abstract, or inconvenient rather than emotionally compelling. This self-focused mindset does not usually feel cruel from the inside. Internally, it feels justified. The person believes they are simply overwhelmed or busy with their own struggles. The brain rationalizes emotional withdrawal by framing it as necessity. "I can't deal with this right now" slowly becomes "this isn't my problem." As this narrative repeats, emotional responsiveness weakens, not because the person hates others, but because the mind has learned to filter them out. In reality, prolonged self-absorption reshapes emotional perception. The brain becomes trained to measure importance based on personal relevance alone. When that happens, empathy no longer arises naturally. Other people's suffering exists, but it does not penetrate emotional awareness. This is one of the quietest ways empathy disappears, not through malice or trauma, but through a sustained inward collapse of attention, where caring for oneself slowly replaces caring about anyone else. Empathy is often treated as a universal human trait, something everyone naturally possesses and expresses in the same way. Psychology shows this belief is false. Empathy is a skill rooted in brain development, emotional learning, and repeated reinforcement. From early childhood, the brain learns empathy through emotional feedback, attachment, and social interaction. When these experiences are consistent and emotionally rich, empathy strengthens. When they are absent, unstable, or ignored, empathy develops weakly or not at all. Feeling for others is not automatic, it is learned and maintained. Neuroscientific research confirms that empathy relies on neural networks that must be activated regularly to remain responsive. Just like any psychological function, unused emotional pathways weaken over time. If a person repeatedly ignores others' pain, suppresses emotional reactions, or exists in environments where compassion is discouraged or unrewarded, the brain adapts by reducing empathic response. This is not a moral failure, it is neural efficiency. The brain conserves energy by disengaging from emotional processes that no longer seem necessary. Life experiences play a critical role in shaping this process. Environments driven by competition, constant pressure, fear, or emotional invalidation teach the mind that emotional sensitivity is a liability. Over time, the brain associates empathy with weakness, distraction, or vulnerability. Psychological conditioning reinforces emotional distance as a functional advantage. In such contexts, empathy is not destroyed violently, it erodes quietly through repeated disuse and negative reinforcement. What makes this reality unsettling is that the loss of empathy rarely looks dramatic. People do not suddenly become cruel or aggressive. Instead, they become emotionally neutral. Indifference replaces concern. Other people's suffering is acknowledged intellectually but fails to trigger emotional urgency. Studies in moral psychology show that indifference often leads to more harm than anger. because it removes internal resistance. When nothing is felt, nothing stops harmful inaction. This is why indifference is more dangerous than obvious cruelty. Cruelty still contains emotion, indifference contains none. When empathy fades, people do not see themselves as doing wrong. They simply stop caring. Psychology makes one thing clear: empathy must be nurtured, practiced, and reinforced to survive. Without that reinforcement, it does not disappear loudly. It fades silently, leaving behind a world where suffering exists, and fewer people feel compelled to respond. The scariest people aren't always the loud or aggressive ones. Sometimes, they're the ones who feel nothing at all. Understanding this dark reality isn't about fear, it's about awareness. Because empathy, once lost, doesn't announce its disappearance. It simply leaves, quietly.